I have a gig coming up in about a week. I'm playing as part of a musical ensemble with about 10 other people, and what I want to do is create a patch that has a super oscillator that does all of the nice things you'd ever want an oscillator to do, a generative envelope system, and then I need to find a control surface to control it all with. So some of the decisions I need to make, I need to figure out which computer I want to use in the live setting. I have a few different computers, and depending on the size, how powerful I need it to be will change which computers I end up using. Then I need to figure out what I can pack, what will work for the day, like if I need to figure out if I have transport, which cases I have, what it'll fit in, and all those decisions will influence what the end result is. So what I'll be doing is I'll be creating an oscillator in Puredata, which is the program I'll be using for the whole thing. I'll put as many functions to do it as I possibly can. So the first thing I'm going to do is build the oscillator. The oscillator will have a rising pulse wave that just goes at audio rate from 0 to 1. That reads through a wavetable array, and the wavetable sends out that wave just as an audio stream. There's ways that I can manipulate the pulse ramp that activates that wavetable, and that's how I'll be doing a lot of the effects. So that's how I'll do the Sinc, the phase mod effects, the pulse width modulation type effects. And I can also influence the pitch to do things like vibrato and noise. I can create multiple copies of the saw ramp that activates the wavetable and use the same wave buffer, and that way I can also make 5 copies of the oscillator so that I can do super wave effects with 5 oscillators that are all slightly detuned from each other. So this is the wavetable section all patched up. I'll just do a quick test and see if I'm getting sound. So next I'll be adding a sync function. So this is like a fake version of a hard sync that you would get in an analog oscillator. This isn't a free running oscillator that is syncing the primary oscillator. This is just a trick that interrupts the ramp wave that sets off the wavetable and creates a sound that sounds something like wavetables. So if you had 2 oscillators that were running at the same frequency and used one of them as a hard sync, you would get a similar effect to what this spits out. Next up, I'm adding phase mod to this oscillator. This adds a sine wave signal that is a ratio of the primary frequency. Usually I'll have this at either half frequency, the same frequency, or double. Then I add that to the ramp wave that triggers the wavetable, and because it interferes with the phase, you get a sound very much like the DX7 frequency modulation, which is actually phase modulation. In this patch, I won't be adding actual frequency modulation. There is a difference between phase modulation and frequency modulation, but I want to keep this simple, so I'm not going to add both of them. So once the phase mod section is complete, I just do a bit of cleaning up, and then I check the audio to make sure everything's working the way that it should. Next, I'll be adding pulse width modulation to the oscillator. I make 2 copies of the ramp wave that's setting off the wavetable. One of them I will times by itself to get an exponential curve, because the ramp wave goes from 0 to 1, and when you times any value between 0 to 1 by itself, then you get an exponential curve up to 1. Anything out of those bounds you get weird behavior, but for a 0 to 1 range this works quite well. And then I'll be making a crossfader that modulates between them. I'll be morphing the input wave that goes into it so that it is exponential, and that'll create a ramp through the wave instead of going through it cleanly, and that'll create a pulse width modulation type effect. This will maintain the pitch of the oscillator, but once you fade in the exponential curve version of the ramp wave, you have an LFO that sort of modulates between the linear and exponential ramp. You get a pulse width modulation type sound effect. Once that's done, quickly check the audio, make sure everything's working. Next, I'll be adding vibrato, and I'll be adding that to the pitch information that gets sent to the primary ramp wave, and that will give me frequency modulation. Next, I'll be adding the ability to add noise into the oscillator. I'll reuse some of the sections for the vibrato just to do the addition to put the noise into the waveform. Next up is a function generator. This will create a attack decay envelope, which will control the amplitude of the oscillator. And this has variable attack speed, decay speed, and I'm also going to add controls so that it will sit at the top of the envelope for a while. So you've got attack, hold, decay. And then also there'll be a variable delay between the end of the envelope and when it re-triggers, because this will be re-triggering on a loop. I'll be making 3 of these. So what you get is 3 oscillators that fade in and out with different timings. So rather than being a regular rhythmic pulse of melody, instead it'll sort of sound more like waves crashing on the ocean, but it's melody as opposed to just the ocean. Once that's done, I set up a few sine wave oscillators and just do a quick audio test to make sure it's doing what I want it to do. One function I want to add to this oscillator is a superwave feature. In this case, I'll have 5 oscillators and they'll all be ever so slightly off pitch, and that'll create a nice phasing effect between all the different waves. And it also means I can spread that out over the stereo field to get a very wide sound. I'll be taking the oscillator, making a copy of all the critical components, taking all of the control components, so those are the things that control how much sync each oscillator has, how much phase mod, the different frequency calculations. I will plug those into all of the other oscillators so that they all follow the same control structure, but they all have their own independent sound and they all track their own independent pitch. Something I like to do when I'm making a complicated patch like this is I'll copy and paste a section of it, take it outside of the area of the main patch, and do an exploded view of all the different components and where they all plug in. So this way I can label them with numbers so that I have a repeatable sequence for attaching all of the different components in, and having it exploded means that I can see clearly where all of the patch points come into it so that I can repeat it and not forget any one section. I'll use this whilst I'm repeating this process and making all these oscillators, and then once I'm finished I'll delete it. For the quantizer section, I'm going to copy and paste some of the quantizers from some of my other patches, and then I'll modify it for what I need it to do in this particular patch. With that done, I'm going to add MIDI controller function. So I need to choose which MIDI controller I want to use for this setup. I have a few different MIDI controllers to choose from. I'll choose one of the smaller controllers that I have. It'll force me to figure out which controls I really need to control so that I don't just have functions for everything. I have to think about what will make the best sounds. This is another thing that I'm going to copy and paste from another patch because I've already worked with this MIDI controller before, and I'll just paste that in here. Then I'll grab all of the patch points for this MIDI controller and just pipe them straight into the super oscillator and get it to control everything that I want to in this. With the MIDI implementation completed, that's the patch all done. I'll do a quick test of the audio, make sure everything's working, and then after that I'll need to move it to a computer, and that will come later. So here's a quick test of the audio. And that's it. So the patch is completed. What I'll need to do now is try this patch on my 2 computers. I have a laptop that's not particularly powerful, so I'll try it on that first because it's the most portable option. If it runs okay on that system, then I'll use that one. If not, I'll bring my less portable, more powerful computer, and I'll be doing that next. So there should be a video coming up in a day or 2 once I've been able to do the transfer, put the system on this other computer, give it a test run, figure out what I need for this particular gig, and we'll go from there. Thanks for watching.